Tonight, we are learning more about a woman found dead after a 911
hang-up call and discovered Carrie dead in the home.
I took some time off to rest.
Found 37-year-old Kevin Frazier with a gunshot wound.
On April 7, 2022, in Copperas Cove, Texas, a 37-year-old man named Kevin Frazier shot and killed his 33-year-old wife, Destiny Carey, inside her own home. He then opened fire on the police officer who responded to the call, wounding him. In this investigation, we're breaking down what drove a man to kill his own wife and why, with police already on scene, he chose to open fire on law enforcement instead of surrendering. Destiny Jasmine Carey was born and raised in Texas. By the time she was 33, she'd built a life that held down several roles at once: nurse, entrepreneur, mother of 5, and grandmother to 1 grandchild. During the day, she worked as a nurse in Georgetown, a job that demands responsibility, composure, and a constant presence at other families' hardest moments. Alongside that, she ran her own business in Killeen. 2 stores called High Sadity Boutique and High Sadity Shoutique. This had a cheaty Bates, located at 1103 West Veterans Memorial Boulevard, Suite 105. This wasn't a side hustle or a hobby. The business was growing, and Destiny was already planning a 3rd store, this time in Dallas, meaning she was pushing into a bigger, new market.
Learned she was a rising entrepreneur in the Central Texas area and even a business owner in Killeen.
People who knew her described her without a shred of hesitation as someone inspiring, full of life, someone who wanted good things for everyone around her. These weren't vague, generic compliments. The same specific language came up independently from different people: relatives, business acquaintances, customers at her stores. 5 kids, a nursing career, a growing business with ambitions to expand into a 3rd city. All of it points to a woman who didn't sit still and didn't let circumstances dictate her life for her. In her business, she leaned not just on her physical storefronts, but on a social media presence too. That's where she found customers, partners, and people willing to help build her brand. One of those people, a business acquaintance named Brandon Martin, would later end up playing a role in this story. But at the time they met, he was, first and foremost, someone helping her business grow. As a mother of 5 and a grandmother, Destiny carried the household, the parenting, and a nurse's work schedule all at once. And by every account from people close to her, she did it without any visible strain, staying to the people around her an open, upbeat person. Kevin Frazier, her husband, was 4 years older at 37. He worked as a long-haul truck driver, which meant long stretches away from home, and equally long stretches when he was there constantly. According to sources, Frazier already had a prior criminal conviction, though the details of that record aren't disclosed in available materials. People who dealt with Frazier day to day didn't describe him as someone with a short temper who blew up once a year. They described a pattern of behavior that was controlling and aggressive at the same time. He kept track of where his wife went and when. He physically blocked her from leaving the house, standing in doorways or blocking exits. And when he himself was locked out, he didn't look for a way to work it out. He broke windows to get inside by any means necessary. His job as a truck driver created a misleading appearance of freedom for Destiny in that sense. Her husband would leave for runs, and on the surface, that could look like a break. But going by descriptions of his behavior, his physical absence didn't mean his control let up. He kept tabs on his wife from a distance, and his returns home became flashpoints for renewed tension rather than relief. Destiny and Kevin were together for around 10 years. Witnesses who knew the couple closely would later describe the relationship with a single word: conflictual. Not occasionally tense, but genuinely conflictual, marked by constant fighting and physical aggression from the husband from early on. Destiny's cousin, Prudence Stiegel, recalled one specific incident. Frazier punched Destiny in the face while they were in the car, in the middle of a drive, somewhere there was nowhere to escape to. There was another, separate incident during the pandemic lockdown. Frazier punched Destiny in the face while they were in bed. Afterward, 2 of her daughters tried to stop him, and Frazier, met with resistance, fled through a window. How Frazier treated Destiny's children raised serious concerns too. According to witnesses, Frazier would drag the daughters down the stairs. In one incident, he put one of them, a girl named Eagle, in a chokehold, and she had to bite him to break free. His control wasn't limited to physical acts inside the house during moments of conflict. Frazier asked the brother of one of Destiny's daughters to secretly monitor her movements and report back on where she went and who she saw, effectively building his own surveillance network around his wife using her own family, turning the people close to her into an instrument of control. Separately from that, cameras were later found in the house that Destiny had originally planned to install for her business, but they turned out to be hidden inside the house itself, recording both audio and video. Sources don't clearly explain who hid those cameras or for what purpose, but the mere fact of hidden surveillance inside a house where a woman was already living with a man tracking her every move through her own relatives adds one more layer to an already total picture of control. It's telling too how differently people in their circle perceived Destiny and Kevin. People spoke of Destiny with warmth and respect. Relatives, business partners, and customers at her stores all saw her as someone dependable, energetic, someone you could count on. Frazier, on the other hand, was described by the people who saw him up close in the language of alarm. His behavior characterized as controlling and aggressive, not simply hot-tempered. That gap in perception between the image of a confident businesswoman in public and what was happening behind closed doors at home is characteristic of relationships where abuse stays hidden from outsiders for years and only comes to light once the people affected, or those close to them, start speaking about it themselves. Against this backdrop, Destiny had been building toward a decision that would ultimately become the turning point of this entire story. She wanted a divorce.
Did tell me, quote, "My mom was a hard-working woman who took care of all 6 of us."
She was getting ready to file the paperwork officially. What's more, Frazier was due in court on a child support matter the following week after the day this investigation is about to describe, meaning the divorce had stopped being just a subject of family arguments and had become a legal reality. With dates, obligations, and court procedures, Frazier couldn't escape and couldn't resolve with another broken window or another blocked door. Shortly before this, something happened that, by all appearances, became the final straw for Frazier. He learned his wife had met up at a bar with Brandon Martin, the Killeen businessman and social media acquaintance who was helping promote her boutique online. The meeting, by all appearances, was about business. Martin was, to Destiny, more of a business contact helping grow her store's online presence than anything else. But when Frazier found out, he started calling people he believed were connected to what was happening. One of the people he called was a woman named Shawana Martin, someone who shared Brandon's last name but had no connection to him whatsoever and wasn't even married to him. Frazier, by all appearances, mistakenly decided Shawana was Brandon's wife and called her several times in a row, convinced her husband was cheating on her with Destiny. In one of those calls, he said something that would later become one of the key details of this entire story. He said he was heading back to Texas and it would all be over with Carrie. The nature of that mistake is worth noting on its own. Frazier, by all appearances, was convinced there was an entire web of affairs and hidden connections surrounding his wife, and acted on that conviction, calling what amounted to near random people just to find something confirming his suspicions. Shawana Martin, who had nothing to do with either Destiny or the alleged affair, got pulled into this simply because she happened to share a last name with Destiny's business partner. What that phrase actually meant to him in that moment is a question without a definitive answer, but the sequence of events itself falls into a pattern that's well documented in stories like this one. A woman decides to leave a relationship where control and abuse have been building for years, and the man losing that power over her responds not with acceptance, but with escalation. It's the moment of separation itself, not the point where abuse peaks within the relationship, but the moment the victim decides to leave it. That's statistically considered the most dangerous period for victims of domestic violence. At this point, Destiny was doing everything that should, logically, have increased her safety and independence. She was preparing to formalize the divorce, getting ready for a child support hearing, continuing to run her business, and live a life increasingly separate from her husband, meeting with business partners. And yet that exact movement toward freedom, by all appearances, is what triggered what happened next. Open questions remain here that available materials don't directly answer. Did Destiny understand how dangerous this specific phase of separation could be? Not the domestic violence itself, but the moment she finally decided to end it. Did she know about her husband's calls to Shawana Martin and the phrase he'd used about coming back to Texas? What exactly was happening between the two of them in those days? While Frazier, by all appearances, had already made some kind of decision, and Destiny kept moving toward the divorce, not backing off her path and with no idea what her own resolve would lead to. The sources don't answer these questions, but the timeline itself, the divorce, the looming child support hearing, the bar meeting, the threatening phone calls, adds up to a picture of mounting tension looking for a way out. Before we go further, if this case has your attention, hit that like button. It tells us these are the stories worth telling. Subscribe so you don't miss the next investigation, and drop a comment. What's your read on this case so far? Now, back to it. On the evening of April 6th, 2022, tension that had been building inside that house for months spilled, for the first time, beyond its four walls and became known to outside parties. A call was officially logged, and police came to the address. Destiny demanded that Frazier leave the house. Responding officers removed him from the property. At that point, it looked like an ordinary domestic dispute resolved through the usual channel. The husband was taken away, the wife was left alone in the house. The incident was formally closed, the report was filed, the situation was under control. But calls like that rarely put a period on a long-running conflict. They only log its latest chapter. By the very next morning, Frazier was back at the house he'd been removed from the night before. Back somewhere, by every indication, no one had invited him to return. April 7th was supposed to be the day Destiny's new life, separate from her husband, began. That was the day she planned to officially file for divorce and bring the question of child support from Frazier before the court, which means her husband's return to the house that same morning. The very morning his wife planned to legally lock in their split happened on a day that carried enormous significance for both people in this story. For Destiny, it was a day of liberation, the day an abstract intention to leave turned into signed paperwork and a filing registered with the court. For Frazier, who by all appearances had already learned of her plans, it was the day after which there would be no legal way back. Around 10 in the morning, Destiny's cousin, Prudence Stiegel, was on the phone with her. The call started out like any ordinary conversation between relatives. Nothing at the outset suggested this call was destined to be their last, not until Destiny's voice changed. At some point she screamed, first, by all appearances, at Frazier, telling him to stop, and then, into the phone, speaking directly to her cousin, "Call 911. In response, Frazier said something directed at Destiny herself, "You're not going anywhere." A moment later, the call cut out. Prudence Stiegel turned out to be the last person to hear Destiny's voice alive, and there was exactly one thing she could do about it. The one thing she'd been asked to do, call for help. A little over 2 hours passed between that cut-off call around 10 in the morning and the next documented event. What happened inside the house on Hobby Road during that window isn't reported in available sources. Whether Prudence Stiegel called police right away, as Destiny had asked, or whether some time passed before emergency services got their first alert from that address, isn't known. What's known is only that the next contact with the outside world didn't come through the cousin. It came directly through a 911 line, and that call also cut off without giving the dispatcher anything more to go on than screaming. At around 12:25 in the afternoon, a call came into the 911 dispatch center from an address in the 1000 block of Hobby Road. A little over 2 hours after the call with the cousin had cut out, the call was disconnected almost immediately. The connection kept dropping and never allowed the dispatcher to have a full conversation with whoever was on the line. Sources don't specify exactly who made that call. Still, the dispatcher managed to make out screaming in the background, coming from somewhere deep inside the house. A dropped call with screaming in the background is, on its own, one of the most alarming signals a dispatch center can receive. Unlike a full conversation, where a caller manages to give an address, describe the threat, and answer follow-up questions, a cut-off line leaves a dispatcher with almost nothing beyond the bare fact that something is happening right now, somewhere. That was enough to send a patrol officer to the address immediately. Arriving on scene, the officer found himself outside an ordinary house in the Hobby Road neighborhood. He walked up to the front door and knocked. A man's voice from inside answered with a single word, "Wait." That wasn't a request to come back later, and it wasn't an attempt to smooth over a misunderstanding. Screaming continued from inside as this happened, and the officer, hearing it, decided not to wait. Choosing to kick in the door behind which a voice had specifically asked him to wait, with screaming still going on, is a decision made in a matter of seconds, with no way to know in advance what's on the other side, whether the person inside is armed, how many people are in the house, who among them is in danger. That's exactly the decision the officer made. He kicked the door in. The instant the door gave way, several shots rang out from inside the house in quick succession. The officer was hit in the leg. The bullet caught him before he'd even had a chance to step across the threshold of a house he'd been called to in order to save someone's life. Despite this, the officer went inside. What he found was a scene that had already played out before he ever entered the room. Destiny Carey lay motionless by the front door, meaning she was right next to the very door the officer had just kicked in, as if, in her final seconds, she'd been trying to reach the exit. In the living room, on the floor, was Kevin Frazier, with gunshot wounds to his torso. Bleeding from his own wound, the officer didn't wait for backup or medical help for himself. He handcuffed Frazier, even though Frazier, based on the description of the scene, was hardly in a state to pose an active threat at that point, and immediately moved into performing life-saving measures on Destiny. He tried to do what little could be done before paramedics arrived, all while wounded himself, in a room where gunfire had gone off just a minute earlier, with no way of knowing at that moment whether anyone else was still in the house. Paramedics arrived at the address shortly after. They weren't able to save Destiny. She was pronounced dead at the scene by Coryell County Justice of the Peace Bill Price, an official whose presence at a death scene is a mandatory procedural formality in cases like this, and at the same time, the final official word, closing the question of whether Destiny Carey was alive or not. The weapon on record is a Glock 27 semi-automatic pistol, a compact firearm that, according to available information, was already inside the house and ended up being used within the span of a few seconds between the knock on the door and the door being broken down. Domestic violence calls are, statistically, some of the most dangerous calls an officer can respond to. An officer can never know in advance what's waiting on the other side of that door. One aggressive person, an armed person, or a situation that's already moved past anything that can be talked down. That morning, the officer who responded to a dropped call with screaming in the background got his answer in the most direct and brutal way possible. Gunfire through the door he'd just opened himself. What exactly happened in those minutes while the door was still shut and the voice behind it was telling the officer to wait remains unclear. Sources don't explain how Frazier came to have gunshot wounds to his torso, discovered when he was examined inside the house immediately afterward. Police never publicly commented on that question. There are a few possible explanations, and none of them are officially confirmed. The wounds could have come from the same burst of gunfire that killed Destiny. For instance, if the two of them struggled over the weapon in those final seconds, the wounds could have been self-inflicted by Frazier, a scenario that shows up often enough in domestic violence cases that end in murder, where an act of violence against a partner is followed by an attempt to turn the gun on oneself. Finally, the wounds could have come from some other, entirely separate moment that morning, unconnected to Destiny's death, before the call to her cousin, between that call and the 911 call, or in the very seconds the officer stood behind the broken-in door. None of these scenarios is confirmed or ruled out by available sources. With gunshot wounds of his own, Kevin Frazier was taken to Carl R. Darnell Army Medical Center on the Fort Hood base. That's not an ordinary city hospital. Fort Hood is the largest military base in the country, and the hospital on its grounds primarily serves service members and their families. Being taken to that hospital rather than a civilian one in Killeen or Copperas Cove speaks to the sheer size of the base and its proximity to where this happened, and also suggests that whoever transported Frazier chose the nearest, most appropriate facility for severe injuries without wasting time weighing civilian versus military options. In situations like this, where a hospital patient is simultaneously a suspect in a criminal homicide case, standard practice is to post guard at the room. Frazier, in all likelihood, was under continuous law enforcement observation for the entirety of his hospital stay, technically not yet under arrest, but with no real ability to leave the facility of his own accord. While Frazier was being treated, the investigation didn't sit idle. It was during these days, by all appearances, that detectives began piecing together the full picture of what happened, reconstructing the timeline of calls, interviewing anyone who might know something about what had been going on inside the house on Hobby Road in the preceding weeks and months. Prudence Stiegel, the last person to hear Destiny's voice on the phone, turned out to be one of the earliest and most important sources of information for investigators. Her account of the contents of that cutoff call became a key element of what would later form the case's timeline. Beyond the conversation with Prudence Stiegel, investigators had a far broader picture to reconstruct. Interviewing neighbors who might have seen or heard anything in the Hobby Road area that morning reviewing any surveillance footage that turned out to be nearby, and processing the scene forensically, documenting the position of the bodies, recovering shell casings, establishing the exact trajectory of the shots fired. Investigators interviewed Frazier twice, once directly at the hospital while he was still under medical observation, and again later at the police station after his discharge. That decision turned out to matter for the case. Case materials document that Frazier's account, given in 3 separate versions, at the scene, at the hospital, and in the interview at the station, contradicted each other. In other words, whatever version Frazier reportedly gave at the scene of the crime, or in the first minutes afterward, differed from what he told hospital staff, and what he told them at the hospital, in turn, differed from what he said in his interview at the station. Exactly what those contradictions consisted of isn't disclosed in sources. Available materials record only the fact of the discrepancies, not their content. But the nature of inconsistencies like this usually interests investigators even more than the content of any single version. If someone describes the same few minutes 3 different ways, 3 separate times, it either suggests he's deliberately changing his story as he figures out which version puts him in the best position, or it suggests that what happened was so chaotic or traumatic for him personally that giving a coherent account was simply beyond him. On April 9th, 2022, 2 days after Destiny's death, Frazier was discharged from the hospital. That same day, Fort Hood military police took him into custody, without any resistance on his part. The judge set bail on the 2 charges separately, $1 million on the murder charge and $750,000 on the charge of assault against a public servant, meaning the officer who was shot in the leg attempting to enter the house. Combined bail came to $1,750,000, an amount that effectively ruled out any possibility of Frazier being released before trial. For comparison, bail on lesser charges is often set in the tens of thousands of dollars, not the millions. The figure set in this case directly reflects how seriously the justice system, even at this early stage, weighed both the severity of what happened and the potential danger Frazier could pose if he were free before trial. The separate charge for the assault on the officer underscores that investigators, from the very start, treated this not as a single act, but as 2 distinct crimes: the murder of his wife and an armed attack on a law enforcement officer, committed within the same few minutes. Frazier was formally charged with murder in June 2022, roughly 2 months after the crime itself, and after he was already in custody. That gap, from his arrest in April to the formal charge in June, is typically taken up by wrapping up the initial investigation, gathering case materials, expert findings, and the formal process of bringing the case before a grand jury, which decides whether there's enough evidence for an official charge. The police department's response to one of its own officers being shot was swift and predictable for cases like this. An investigation into the circumstances of an officer being wounded in the line of duty typically runs in parallel with the investigation into the murder itself, and the wounded officer becomes one of the key witnesses in the combined case. An officer being shot in the line of duty within his own department rarely stays a routine footnote. It triggers an internal review of the use of force involved, an assessment of whether the decision to break down the door was justified given everything known at the time, and, as a result, additional scrutiny of this specific call from department leadership. His account of what he heard through the door, what the voice inside said back to him, and what happened in the moment the door came down would later become one of the load-bearing pillars of the entire case against Frazier. For Destiny's 5 children, those 2 days, April 7th and 8th, became a period of complete uncertainty. The mother who held their daily life together was dead, and decisions about who would care for them, and how, in the days immediately ahead, had to be made by relatives on the spot, with no time to prepare. The question of custody would officially be settled later, but in those first hours and days, someone among the family inevitably had to step in and take responsibility for 5 children left without their mother and without their stepfather, who was already in custody. First at the hospital and then in jail, Kevin Frazier's trial began April 22nd, 2026 in Coryell County, 4 years after Destiny Carey's death. 4 years is enough time for children who'd lost their mother to visibly grow up, while bail remained unchanged and the defendant himself stayed in custody the entire time, waiting for a trial that would answer the question that had hung over the case from day one of the investigation. Was this murder, or something the law defines differently?
I took a couple, I took some time off to rest, and now it's game time, bitches.
Delays like this between arrest and the start of a trial aren't unusual for cases of this severity. Gathering and vetting evidence, appointing attorneys, motions from both sides, and a backlogged county court system can stretch the wait into years. But for a family waiting for trial, those years meant the wound inflicted on April 7th, 2022 remained officially unresolved all the way until the spring of 2026. One of the key witnesses for the prosecution was Prudence Stiegel. At trial, she described both the call on the day Destiny died and the history of abuse in the marriage that had built up over the years before the tragedy. Testimony that formed the basis for how the jury was presented with the entire backstory of the relationship between Destiny and Frazier. Brandon Martin, the Killeen businessman who helped promote Destiny's boutique, told the court about meeting her at a bar, the same meeting that by all appearances became the trigger for the string of alarming phone calls Frazier made in the days leading up to the murder. His testimony at trial, in essence, confirmed that the meeting itself was purely about business, nothing like the suspicions Frazier had projected onto his wife. Shawana Martin, for her part, testified about Frazier's calls, which contained threats directed at his wife, testimony that gave the jury direct evidence of the state Frazier was in during the final days before April 7th, and of the fact that his suspicions were directed at people who had nothing at all to do with the alleged affair. Testimony from one of Destiny's daughters, identified in case materials as Eagle, took on particular weight during the trial. She told the court her mother had kept her home from school on the day of the murder, out of fear of Frazier. That fact alone, that on her final morning, Destiny gave instructions not to let her daughter go to school, out of fear of something from her own husband, says something about how tension in that house was already being felt well before the call to her cousin and well before the 911 call. According to her, her mother had told her that Frazier had threatened to kill her if she left him, meaning a threat that, by all appearances, came directly from Frazier and was aimed at Destiny, was known to her children too, not something that stayed strictly between the spouses. Prosecutors presented the court with a text message Frazier sent to that same daughter on the day of the murder. "No matter what, I will always love you, now and for the rest of my life." The daughter described that message with a single word: creepy. Beyond that, the court was shown a Facebook Live recording of the couple arguing, direct video evidence of the nature of their relationship, captured by the couple themselves before the tragedy and preserved in the public record, meaning it was available to the jury not as a witness's second-hand account, but as direct audiovisual evidence of exactly how this couple fought with each other. The daughter's testimony and the text message together create one of the heaviest details of the entire trial. A man who, on the same day he killed his wife, thought to send her daughter a message about eternal love, while having previously threatened to kill that same woman if she ever decided to leave. Putting those two facts side by side, a threat to kill and a declaration of love addressed to the victim's child on that same day, leaves little room to read it as anything other than deeply contradictory and disturbing behavior from a man who, by all appearances, had already made up his mind. Serving as an expert witness at trial was Detective Erin Newton of the Waco Police Department, who specializes in domestic violence cases. Bringing in an expert like this is standard practice in cases where the prosecution is trying to help the jury understand the behavior of both victim and defendant through the lens of patterns common to domestic violence cases generally, not just the specific facts of one case. She testified that the moment a domestic violence victim decides to leave a relationship is, statistically, the most dangerous period in terms of the risk to her life. That's when we see the most violence and homicides, she told the court. On April 30th, 2026, the jury delivered its verdict. Frazier was found not guilty of murder. At the same time, he was found guilty of criminally negligent homicide and of deadly conduct resulting in injury to a police officer. In effect, the jury drew a distinction between the two charges tied to Destiny's death and the officer's injury, finding guilt only on the lesser versions of both counts, while declining to classify Destiny's death as murder in the legal sense of the term. Formally, this means the jury didn't find sufficient grounds to conclude Frazier shot Destiny intentionally, meaning to kill her, but did find that his actions were reckless and dangerous enough to cause her death. The difference between these two conclusions might look like a matter of legal fine print, but Frazier's entire future hinged on it. From a possible life sentence under a murder conviction to the far lighter sentence ultimately handed down on the counts he was actually convicted of. According to available information, Before reaching this verdict, the jury deadlocked 11-1 and eventually arrived at a compromise. That means the overwhelming majority of jurors, by all appearances, leaned toward a different classification of what happened, but couldn't convince the one holdout, and the panel ultimately settled on language all 12 could agree to. The mechanism of a jury verdict in an American criminal trial requires unanimity. If even one of 12 disagrees, the panel either has to keep deliberating until it reaches consensus, or the court declares what's known as a mistrial, requiring the case to be retried with a new jury. The fact that this case reached an 11-1 split without ending in a declared mistrial suggests that at some point, one side, either the majority or the lone holdout, shifted their position enough to arrive at language all 12 could accept. What exactly that single holdout vote was arguing for, a harsher or a more lenient outcome, sources don't reveal, nor do they reveal the reasoning behind that position. On May 1st, 2026, the court handed down Frazier's sentence, 10 years in prison for criminally negligent homicide and 2 years for deadly conduct resulting in injury to the officer. Both sentences were ordered to run concurrently rather than consecutively, meaning Frazier will, in effect, serve 10 years total, since the shorter sentence is absorbed into the longer one. The fact that these sentences were ordered to run at the same time, rather than one after another, often becomes a separate source of outrage for victims' families. Legally, it means the shooting of a police officer, itself a serious crime, added not a single extra day to Frazier's sentence beyond what he already received for his wife's death. Given that he'd already spent 4 years in custody awaiting trial, the time remaining before any possible release is reduced by that period, though the exact terms for crediting pre-trial detention and any possibility of parole aren't specified in available sources. The final charge, criminal negligence instead of murder, establishes a fundamental legal distinction between two categories of crime. A murder charge requires proven intent to take a life, whereas criminal negligence applies to situations where death results from a serious breach of the duty of care without direct intent to kill. In practice, this means the jury, weighing the exact same evidence, years of documented abuse, threats, phone calls, the text message to her daughter on the day of the murder, concluded that evidence was enough to establish Frazier's responsibility for his wife's death, but not enough to establish that he shot her meaning to kill her. For the jury, by all appearances, the deciding question came down to Frazier's intent in the moment of the shooting, a question whose answer depended on what jurors ultimately found more convincing: testimony about years of threats and control, or the conflicting versions of events Frazier himself gave in the days right after it happened. Versions whose specific details, however, aren't laid out in available case materials. After the sentence was handed down, Kevin Frazier was transferred to begin serving his sentence, 10 years in prison. Custody of Destiny's 5 children passed to her sister, Demetria Fifi, who lives in Georgia. A woman who was hundreds of miles from Copperas Cove on the day of the tragedy took on responsibility for her nieces and nephews, practical, financial, and emotional responsibility for 5 children left without their mother, and without a stepfather who is now behind bars. At the sentencing hearing, Demetria Fifi spoke and addressed Frazier directly. "You've already taken her life, and you're still showing no remorse." Those words, spoken face to face with the man found responsible for her sister's death, were one of the few chances the family had to speak directly to him within the court proceedings themselves. A moment that, in cases like this, often becomes the only official platform victims' relatives get. Unlike witness testimony, which gives jurors facts, an address like this at sentencing isn't aimed at the panel anymore. It's aimed at the man who was convicted, and it serves a human purpose rather than an evidentiary one, saying out loud what would otherwise have gone unsaid. Fifi's reaction to the outcome of the case was mixed, and largely reflected the contradictions built into the final verdict itself. "We are disappointed, very disappointed," she said. "We did not expect the charge to be reduced to negligent homicide at all." At the same time, she acknowledged the flip side of that outcome. "We did still get some justice because he could have walked with probation." Fifi's sharpest comments were reserved for the mechanism that led to this compromise in the first place. "I would have rather them gave us a mistrial before they gave up 20 to 30 years to this guy. It was just a real bad miscarriage of justice." Behind that statement is a direct criticism of that 11-1 deadlock discussed earlier. In Fifi's view, the panel should have declared a mistrial rather than settle on a compromise that reduced Frazier's degree of guilt, even at the cost of another retrial and further delay of justice for the whole family. Beyond the emotional and legal dimensions of the case, the family also faced a very practical question. How to support 5 children left without their family's main breadwinner, especially since the source of that income, her boutiques in Killeen, was also left without an owner able to keep running the business. Demetria Fifi organized a fundraiser through GoFundMe with a goal of $60,000, meant to cover accumulated debts, the children's day-to-day needs, and a trip to Disney World that Destiny herself had been planning for her kids while she was alive, but never got the chance to make happen. Mentioning that specific trip in the fundraiser description isn't an incidental detail. For the family, it became a symbol of what Destiny had wanted to give her children and what her death took from them, and the fundraiser became an attempt to at least partially finish what Destiny herself had started. As of the most recent available figures, the fundraiser had collected around $5,866 from 39 donors. This case also raised a sharp systemic question. Police responded to a domestic violence call the night before the murder, made Frazier leave the house, but he came back the next day and killed her. For many following this case, that fact became the single biggest source of concern. The system technically worked as designed, applying the standard response procedure for a domestic dispute, but that procedure did nothing to prevent a tragedy that happened less than 24 hours later. Finally, the verdict itself, criminal negligence instead of murder, sparked a public debate about how juries classify deaths that occur in the context of domestic violence in the first place, a debate that reached well beyond this single case, touching on the broader question of just how adequately the legal system responds to deaths resulting from years of documented family violence. Some questions remain that open sources never answered. What exactly the single juror who held out, creating the 11-to-1 deadlock before the panel found a compromise, was actually arguing for isn't disclosed anywhere. Sources reveal neither that juror's position, nor the reasoning behind it, nor whether that lone vote was pushing for a harsher or more lenient outcome than the other 11. Frazier's prior criminal record, predating this case, is mentioned in sources only as a bare fact, with no specifics about what he was previously convicted of, or for how long, meaning it's unknown whether the jury even learned about that history during the trial, or whether it factored into their final decision. Today, years after April 7th, 2022, Destiny Carey is remembered not by the language of a verdict, but by who she was in life. A nurse, an entrepreneur, a mother who wanted good things for everyone around her and kept building, right up to her last day, the very life she was trying to break free into. The 5 children left without her, and the sister who took on raising them, chose none of what happened in that house on Hobby Road that April day, and didn't choose the fact that justice for their mother ultimately came down to a finding of criminal negligence. Their lives go on now without her, in another state, in their aunt's house. And this story leaves one last question behind. How many more lives does a single verdict of criminal negligence have to cost before a domestic violence victim's cry for help gets heard in time, instead of after the line has already gone dead?